patriotism, faith, national unity, education, fiscal responsibility, civility, the values that define America. Fascinating stories and talks from America-loving patriots dedicated to preserving freedom, opportunity, and justice. Welcome to the Friends and Fellow Citizens podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 84 of Friends and Fellow Citizens. I'm your host, Sherman Tylowski. Thank you all so much for joining me for this episode. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to our email list, subscribe to our podcast, and also, if you subscribe to our email list, you can check out our new Ask Our Guest feature as soon as April. This is a brand new feature. Check out episode 81 for more details. But basically, this is a great way for guests to be able to answer questions directly from our listeners. I hope you'll take advantage of this new opportunity, and I look forward to hearing your questions. Today's guest has worked in an industry that we haven't touched upon a lot in our episodes, but something that is very critical in understanding why we are so polarized in our society today. We need to find new ways to integrate media better in our civic discourse. I don't think we've gotten to that point, but perhaps we can get some more insight from this week's guest, Ariana Pekary. A public editor for Columbia Journalism Review and advocate for addressing systemic lapses in television news, Ariana Pekary is an award-winning public radio and television news producer with 2 decades of experience. She got her start in public radio work at NPR, KQED, KALW, KGO, SiriusXM, and WNYC before transitioning to MSNBC. In radio, she produced in-depth interviews and documentaries on a range of topics, conducting research, writing scripts, editing, and mixing. Her productions include features on homeless children, rape in prison, and fallen members of the military. Ariana has also produced several series on topics such as mothers in prison, education reform, and the stigma associated with liberalism. As a producer at MSNBC, she produced an Emmy-nominated episode on public housing, in addition to helping plan a live daily program. Ariana is keen to highlight stories often found beneath the fold that help explain those above the fold. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome Ariana to our program. Ariana, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me and for taking up this topic.
Well, this is certainly a very, very interesting topic in regards to the role of the media in our civil discourse. And with this program, we cover a lot about civility, about other issues to bring at least some of that, to resurrect that in our society. Before we get into some of those issues there, though, tell us a bit more about your background and how you really got interested in the journalism career track.
Oh, gosh. I have an unusual background, so bear with me here for a moment. I went through college. I ended up studying English nonfiction writing. I thought that I'd probably either want to do law or journalism, but I wasn't sure which. And I had to work my way through college and didn't take full advantage of the university and the college paper and internships that I could have done. So I panicked upon graduation and went to work for Morgan Stanley Dean Witter as a financial advisor, which was a complete about turn from any of my training or interests. They needed women at the time, and I ended up getting hired there and struggled for a couple of years through that process, and then ended up going to work at a consulting company just outside of DC. And it was really through that commute around the Beltway that I discovered NPR. And I fell in love with it. And so at some point, I didn't know how to kind of break into it, or I didn't have any experience. And then I saw in some continuing education magazine that I was getting, they were advertising a day behind the scenes at NPR. So I took a day off of work and went down for that. And I expected it to be a room full of young people like myself trying to figure out the same thing, but it was mostly elderly people who were retired who wanted to meet Carl Castle and Linda Wertheimer. Um, uh, During that day, they alluded to the need for younger people to work in public radio. So I took that as my cue, went home, found every person I could on the website and then emailed them. One of them, the poor soul, responded. And that's how I got my start in public radio. So he, this man was nice enough, well, send me your resume and writing samples and we'll go from there. And we kept in touch. And then, about 6 months later, something temporary opened up at NPR. And that's how I got my foot in the door. And then I ended up, my first job with them was working with the ombudsman at NPR. And that was for me, that was a great entree. And then I went through the training program, the NPR training program, learned how to make radio and all that jazz, and started getting experience filling in where I could on the shows. I ended up doing a couple of stints on Weekend Edition. And then from there, I ended up moving to San Francisco and, worked at stations there. So that's kind of how I got my entree into radio and journalism. And it was kind of on the job experience. And I just kind of made the most of it. So I didn't go through a journalism program, and I didn't necessarily come up through the traditional means. I had a different job background, but this was my passion. The first day at NPR, I was starting to look, I was reading something online, and I caught myself and I said, oh my gosh, I need to get to work. And then I realized, no, this is what I'm supposed to be doing. This is my job. So, and from that day on, it wasn't a job. It was, I'm kind of did have to take a huge pay cut when I did that, but I loved every day in public radio. And so that's how I started. And I was in public radio for about 12 years.
Wow. That's super awesome to hear that you didn't see it as a job. I feel like that can be a bit of a rarity nowadays, to really love what you're doing and to keep at it. So props to you on finding that passion. Were there any times when you felt that you wanted to do something else, or did you really feel like, no, I'm gonna do this for as long as I can, and nothing at this point can really stop it?
No, once I was in, and I love, especially in public radio, I love the craft of storytelling. I love the human voice and the range of human voices, and how powerful that really is, and how powerful people's stories are. And I love how radio really gets into your head. And I found myself, the reason why I was drawn to radio, I never had a desire for a single day to work in television. I kind of thought maybe print. But as soon as I discovered public radio, it gets in your head and it gauges the imagination. They say, NPR takes you there, and I feel like it does. But I also, what I appreciated was, so often I would hear a story on the radio, and it would be something topical, might be controversial. And as I was listening, I might have certain questions that would come up. But by the time they got to the end of the piece, I felt like they had, addressed or answered a number of those questions that I had, that I felt like it was a complete and fair representation of what they were discussing. And that's what drew me in. And that's why I stuck with it, because public radio does give the space to be able to have those conversations. And I personally just didn't feel like that, I was getting that through any TV journalism. Certainly we can talk more about that later, but that's what drew me in, and that's what hooked me.
Well, that's wonderful. I want to now get into a bit about your career at MSNBC. And as I alluded to earlier, this is a lot about the state of civil discourse, but particularly within our media environment nowadays. What can you tell us about how you got into MSNBC, and really what you started to notice different and things that just weren't working for you as someone who's so drawn to journalism.
Well, it was a bit of a process. First of all, I call myself an accidental cable news producer because it's, again, I never had interest in working in television, but I ended up working as a contributing producer for Alec Baldwin's podcast. He was doing a podcast out of WNYC, and we oddly managed to connect over Twitter, and we had similar interests in terms of the topical story. So his podcast was mostly cultural and entertainment, long form interviews. The format was similar to what I'd been doing before, but not as newsy. And he brought me in to do some of the more newsy type of interviews, so it might be an economist or a thinker of some sort. And we did that for about 2 years. And then he ended up starting a show at MSNBC, and he wanted me to help launch, work on that show and help launch that program. So I agreed. I loved working with him, and it was kind of a dream job for me. One of the other things is I felt like he had the ability to bring in people who otherwise don't normally pay attention to news and politics. He might be able to bring in some of his fan base, entertainment fan base, to reach those people. And so that was, in my mind, and the combination of his natural curiosity about some of these big topics, along with that ability that I thought he was going to have, that was a big draw. And I was very excited to start on that show. It was going to be a once a week, pre-recorded, long form interview, kind of the same, the format was going to be based on his podcast. It was only on air for 5 weeks. Things imploded. He had a public scuffle, and inside the building, the whole process, the launch of that show was very unorganized and very difficult. And so it was kind of a mess on the inside as well. So I knew that. I had that experience, but then I had just moved to New York, and his show got canceled very quickly. I had just signed a lease, so I kind of scrambled to try to get another job wherever I could so I could pay my rent, basically, and tried to make the most of it. And I ended up getting hired by Lawrence O'Donnell's show, The Last Word, which was a 10 p.m. show. And I knew going into it that it was going to be a different beast altogether than working in radio. TV itself is different, but I also understood that the commercialization was going to have some effect on us. I thought, in general, MSNBC, their sensitivities and kind of what they cared about was not necessarily out of line with where I am and the types of stories that I want to cover. But I did understand that there was going to be some difference. And for the first couple of years, it was a very frustrating and confusing time because I didn't fully understand what their mission was. And a lot of the editorial decisions felt arbitrary. And so we might be working on something, and then all of a sudden they would cancel it and try to do something else. And the longer I was there, the more seniority I got. And all of a sudden I was in the meetings planning the rundown with the executive producer. And that's when I really came to understand the extent that ratings have on their editorial decisions. And that all of a sudden they didn't seem arbitrary to me. I understood what they were doing. And so that answered some questions in my mind. But then, then I went through this process of, is it, am I overreacting? Am I being too sensitive to, coming out of the world of public radio where we never considered what was going to rate or what wasn't going to rate? Am I being hypersensitive to that? And is it really that damaging? By the time I started having serious concerns 2016, 2017, through the 2016 campaign, I had concerns, but it wasn't until after that when I really I was more involved in planning the rundown that I really understood the extent of it. And so I started asking for advice. Where else could I go? And I discovered every place in television is like this. So there really isn't any place else to go. So it's like, okay, what about another show? And, I did a stint on, another show and realized that, no, it's the same here as well. So it really is industry wide. They all have the same charter. The mission is the same. And, over time, I just started keeping notes for myself, if for no other reason, because I, was like, is this really a problem? So I wanted to substantiate and be able to go back and look and see. No, yeah, like over time, yes, this really does make a difference, and that's what I discovered. Over time, I felt like it really does make a difference in terms of not just the topics, and it's not just the topics that they take up. They tend to take up the conflict-driven, polarizing topics because they think that that's what they're going to get a visceral reaction out of their audience. But it's also the guests themselves. So it's, they would scrutinize U.S. senators who otherwise they were very popular and people, were smart, and they would judge them the same ways. What it was just on a day-by-day basis. It was, did this person rate well the last time or not? And so it was kind of all encompassing. And that's, but I realized I didn't want to be there anymore, but I was trying to figure out what to do. So that took some time. And then once we were in the middle of the pandemic and the George Floyd crisis and the presidential election, I couldn't stay there anymore. So that's when I decided officially I need to leave, even though I didn't know where I was going to go.
Bring up all these different elements, and it's I try to, it's almost like a headache to just imagine the media cycle from around 2015 2016 till maybe about the 2020 election. Regardless of what people think of President Trump, this is not about pro-Trump or anti-Trump, but it really is about the environment. And I still remember like how much news, how much media was just being like basically squeezed into every single day, 24/7, 365. And I want to know more about how that cycle, the 2016 election and the presidency and run up to 2020, how all that fit in with some of the things you mentioned, like, picking the guests and the editorials. What was the environment like for you when you were working in that field?
Well, the 2016 cycle, I guess, it didn't take them very long to figure out that Trump was kind of a phenomenon that sparked intrigue, good or bad. And I mean, so much has been said and written about this, how everyone would dedicate so much time to him, from carrying his rallies live to, our rundowns. All of a sudden it was, we would leave the lead segment open, not having a definite plan for it, but figuring by 10 o'clock that night, Trump would do or say something that we were going to want to discuss. And so they would kind of say, Trump TBD was how they were going to plan that night's rundown. And then everything else would, fall, after that. Certainly the Democratic candidates, they weren't getting covered. They might plan to do Hillary or Bernie early on, but then by the time 10 o'clock rolled around, they would just be bumped out of the show altogether. So that, there was a study that showed how Trump ended up getting free media coverage. It was 5.6 billion, I think, is what this outlet ended up figuring. He got all this free coverage, and that was more than Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders, Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, all of the other candidates combined. So and I understand, at MSNBC, a lot of the coverage, and, CNN, there was an awful lot of coverage that was negative. But again, he was dominating the discussion, and nobody could else get any oxygen. Nobody could get traction. And so that we know, the effect that had. And again, you said, whatever you think about Donald Trump, and yes, I agree, but no one should be able to manipulate the media the way that he did. And he knew what he was doing. And so anybody else can pick up that playbook and run with it in the future. And so that's, seeing what happened in the past and knowing it can happen again, it was another big concern of mine.
Now, can you tell us a bit more about you mentioned the polarization aspect and how I feel like there's a lot of stories out there that should be told, but obviously they don't get the ratings. What can you tell us more about that process of picking the stories that get more ratings? Like, is there a lot of like kind of data collection, or is it like based on just relationships, or is it a combination of what can you tell us more about that sort of process there?
I mean, it's not a perfect science, and making decisions based on what rates or what they think is going to rate well is, I think it's a terrible way of making editorial decisions in general. But it's also not always accurate. What rated yesterday might not be interesting to people today. There's no real satisfying answer to this, but over time, I found that the more flamboyant or more intriguing a person was, the more likely they were going to get on air. There was an example, I think this was June of 2020, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had made some out, she had a run-in with another congressman, and she was, alleging sexism in the House of Representatives. And that's, wasn't necessarily wrong. And she kind of made her statement on the floor. But that sort of material, we actually had Representative Katie Porter booked that evening to talk about her plan for COVID. And Katie Porter is, she was elected at the same time. She was also very popular, especially for the MSNBC audience. But she flipped a red district. And so she wasn't quite as flamboyant or out there as AOC was or is. And, her topic was something serious. And she had been, confirmed for several days, which, first of all, is not exactly normal. We tend to plan shows on a day-by-day basis. They decided at the last minute, no, we'd rather have some pundits in to talk about AOC and, what she has said, because there's good tape of her on the floor today. We'd rather have her than to talk with Katie Porter about her plan for COVID. And I don't think that, I don't know why it was a choice between the two, but that's how the rundown fell out that day. Again, that I have many issues with that whole process, but that's the choice that they made. And they blatantly canceled Katie Porter because she wasn't willing to come on and talk about AOC and what she said that day. So that's one example, but it's one of many. And in general, people who tend to be a bit more nuanced, people who might be, a little more wonky, they don't necessarily, they weren't necessarily going to be at the top of the list. They're going to go for the people who are throwing flames, much more so than someone who strikes you as a more reasonable person.
It's so unfortunate how when I see and watch stories about the state of polarization in America from some mainstream news source, but then you see examples like that for me, and maybe for a lot of people, I think are just wondering what is going on here. It's almost like, they run one story on the state of polarization, yet there's probably so many examples of what you pointed out. And I want to now look back at that day when you posted on your blog, August 3rd, 2020, about your decision to leave MSNBC. And, I'll obviously let you kind of tell a bit more about the backstory there, but tell us about how you came to writing that post and what that post kind of encapsulates based on your experience and your feelings about how media is run nowadays.
I had just gotten to the point where I can't do this anymore. I didn't feel like the editorial decisions were rooted in journalism, and certainly no journalistic ethics. And it was, there were so many different examples. I can't go into all of them right here, right now, but it was pretty much on a daily basis. I was getting frustrated about and watching these decisions that they would make. Finally, there were times, through that summer, there was information coming in about COVID. Would try to book a scientist to talk about that. There were lots of discussions about the economy. One particular day, there was a report about how the economy was adversely affecting minorities and African Americans. I had, kind of suggested and encouraged them to do a segment about that, and they decided to do it. But late in the day, the host came in and said he didn't think that it was going to rate very well. So they canceled that, and they canceled The Economist that they had booked for it. So I just couldn't do that anymore, especially in the middle of all of these crises. And the pandemic started. They covered it in earnest as they should have. So they were focusing on the science. They were talking to doctors in ER rooms. They were, getting frontline workers, and that is, we were in an emergency situation, and I felt like, okay, they know what their job is, and they know how to do it. And they ended up, they started doing a weekly special during our hour, hosted by Dr. Zeke Emanuel. And it was, the full hour was to talk about COVID and all the different issues related to it. And after a couple of weeks, they discovered that wasn't rating very well. It wasn't rating as well as they thought it should. And so they bumped it back to Friday nights, and then eventually canceled it because they didn't feel like it was rating as well as it should. That process landed me. I decided I'm not going to re-up. I don't know what I'm going to do. I still didn't know what I was going to do at that point, but nothing about that job was satisfying. I decided I need to figure, something else out. I didn't know where I was going to go. I still don't know where I'm going to go. I'm still working on that. I'm working on putting together an organization, but that also is another process. I knew when I resigned throughout all of these editorial meetings, they knew that I didn't think that they were doing the right thing. So there was no question as far, where I stood in terms of the editorial decisions that they were making. And, I even challenged the president of the network a few weeks before I resigned in a meeting that we had. So I knew why I was leaving. They knew why I was leaving. I told them I don't know where I'm going to go, but I can tell you right now, my frustrations are with the industry. They're not with you, my colleagues. You're doing your job. And that's one of the problems as I saw it. I don't know where I'm going to go, but, I wish you all well. And then when I wrote my post, I really didn't expect it to get much attention. I thought I might get a handful of people who I used to work with react to it, on Facebook or what have you. But it got a lot more attention than I expected, which in my mind was a good thing. But when I wrote it, I more so wanted to kind of draw a line in the sand and say, I'm not going to do this anymore, and this is why. So as I move forward, I could point to this and say, this kind of explains who I am as a journalist and what's important to me. And these are the reasons why. And so that was my intention in writing that post more than anything. I'm glad it resonated with a lot of people. And so that was the thought process going into that.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for sharing about the lead up to the post, because when I read it, I thought this is one of the most honest things I've seen directly from someone who formerly worked in journalism. Now, not to say that people, as you pointed out, I think you have the right approach, which is it's not necessarily about the people themselves, it's the industry. And I'm also wondering a little bit about the leadership aspect, because obviously, I mean, even though we're talking a whole industry, there's different networks, right, with different leadership things. So how much of the of the financial incentives in media and industry is coming from the leadership or the particular people who run these networks and the connections that they have, or is it merely just purely based on the technology and just the way that we consume news that kind of fueled the way that news media organizations get money from ratings and all that?
A lot. I will say some of this is self-imposed, and it's self-imposed because there are financial incentives built into the management structure, meaning hosts get ratings bonuses if they hit certain numbers. They will get a 10% bonus. So if you're making $5 million a year, which is not unusual, then you get an extra $500,000 if you hit your numbers. And that's a significant incentive. So people make these decisions on their own. And I remember one night, not long after, and the top producers also get those bonuses. So it's the decision makers in the process who are especially incentivized to make those decisions. And going back, in our, in the wider editorial meetings or staff meetings that we have, they don't talk as much about what rates well versus what doesn't rate well. But it was in the smaller meetings with the top producers on the show where they were much, they had loose lips in terms of discussing what was going to rate, what wouldn't rate well. It was often the first thing out of their mouth, when I suggested an idea or anyone suggested an idea. That was kind of it was front of mind for them. But it's interesting that, you asked that question because there was a night after George Floyd was killed and the protests had started, the video was out. It was early on, but they asked, the president asked if my host, Lawrence O'Donnell, would do a full hour on George Floyd and what happened. And my host is I'm sure there was a reason why he asked that, because he's somewhat of an expert on police use of force. He's written extensively about this. He wrote a book called Deadly Force. His father had been a Boston police officer and then a lawyer who represented cases. He knows these issues inside and out. And so Phil Griffin asked if Lawrence would do this hour. And the executive producer, his initial reaction was he didn't want to do it because he thought it was going to tank the ratings. They at that point, they wanted to stay focused on Trump and how he was handling the pandemic and all of the politics that was going back and forth. He didn't want to turn away from that coverage because that's, that was rating well. And that's what everybody wanted to do to cover this story about George Floyd, the man who died in Minneapolis. And, maybe Phil Griffin knew that, it would ultimately rate well, but my boss, my executive producer, who was my immediate supervisor, his initial reaction was, that's not going to rate well. I don't want to spend a whole hour on it. So again, it's kind of self-imposed, but it's imposed because of these financial incentives that are built into the process.
Great. Gosh, Trump obviously comes up so much. So a lot of people probably like myself are not surprised by something like that or that kind of a reaction. You mentioned how you're kind of like a free bird now. You're kind of going out and being more freelance. Obviously, you've done a lot of different stories about various different topics. What has it been like to now be out of MSNBC and looking for new ventures? What has it been like to do that? Not only do that, but also really look more into how we can restructure financial incentives. So kind of the things that you're thinking about or things that you want to look more into in the future.
Well, I've been writing for Columbia Journalism Review. And so that's given me an opportunity to talk more about what I see are the structural issues of the industry kind of on an ongoing basis. And, as I said, when I resigned, this is not about the people who I work with. This is about the structure of the industry and reliance on those financial incentives to pay our salaries. So first of all, I haven't missed being at MSNBC one day. I'm happy not to be there anymore. I will say it's been very difficult though. trying to do what I want to do is enormous, which is force the industry to have a reckoning of some sort. We know what the problems are. Ideology and bias, that's always going to exist, but it's just amped up that much more by these financial incentives. There was a study done after the 2020 election and going into, it looked at cable news coverage through the January 6th insurrection. And cable news did as much to amplify misinformation as anyone else. They were repeating this material on the screen even after, Trump was kicked off of Twitter, but they were still showing those tweets, weeks afterwards that contained false information. And they do that because they know there's some journalistic reason to do that at some point. But to the extent that they did it, it was because they knew that that's going to rile up the audience one way or the other. So looking at that and knowing what that is, it's hard for me just to walk away and say, oh, that stinks. There's nothing we can do about it. And unfortunately, a lot of people have that opinion. Even veterans of the industry or academics, people who see it and understand the problem and wish it weren't that way. There's a lot of cynicism. There's kind of a lot of apathy. The Aspen Institute did a report of several months ago about disinformation and misinformation in the media. It was an 80-page report, and I was excited to read it. I wanted to know what they came up with. And they barely mentioned cable news at all throughout this entire report. And, they mentioned cable twice throughout the word cable twice, Fox News once in a footnote, and they didn't mention CNN or MSNBC at all throughout this report. And I was I was shocked because when you're talking about these problems, I don't know how you can just ignore the role that cable news has in all of that. There are people who feel like cable news is kind of a dinosaur. Don't worry about it anymore. It's dying off. It's not that influential. And I disagree wholeheartedly, because when you ask voters where they get the information, by and large, the last two elections, it's been cable news where they get their information. When you look at hour by hour, their ratings, their numbers might not be that big when you think about, the US population overall, but cable news is on 24 hours a day. So if you're trying to compare those numbers against the nightly news, which is, let's say total audience per hour in cable news is 1 to 2 million viewers an hour. The newscasts, the nightly newscasts on the networks, whether it's NBC, CBS, or ABC, those numbers are more like 6 million. But that's only 30 minutes, and they don't really cover politics. They might, they'll touch on kind of the headlines of the day, but then they, will move on to other subjects. So you're not getting 24-hour coverage of these topics. And so it's a little bit frustrating for me trying to make that argument that the cable is something that we need to pay attention to and focus on, because I hear people repeating things that I know they heard on cable news, whether it was MSNBC or Fox. I hear it in personal gatherings, and it kind of baffles me to think that cable news is not a problem and it's not something that we should really spend time focusing on. I'm having a little more luck now getting people to listen. And the other problem is, there's the First Amendment. So freedom of speech, like you can't really dictate what journalists, what these outlets, in theory, they're journalists. You can't dictate, what they can and can't say. There was the fairness doctrine that was repealed. He can't really fight that fight again. I understand that, but I feel like there are other things that could be done to incentivize them externally. You might not be able to shame them altogether, but I think by educating the audience and the public about how they function and this idea that this is hate for profit, very few people are benefiting off of this. By and large, the public at large, the audiences, they're the ones who are suffering. Very few are benefiting at their expense. And that's our democracy right there. That's what my focus is. And what can we do? I think that, kind of a massive public awareness campaign about cable news and, how they make the decisions that they make. And they're doing it for profit. They're not doing it for the betterment of everyone. They don't think about public service. CNN, they've gone through some a change in leadership recently. The board members and the people leading the stockholders of the people who run Discovery, which is going to be taking over CNN, the people at Time Warner, they've been asked, what do you think about CNN and what about CNN Plus? And they refer to those news outlets as, quote, assets. Well, we think this is a good asset, so we're sticking with it. That's the monetization of news. And that's how they think about it. Those are the people who are in real control. And so I think part of this is educating the audience about the incentives that are built in and how that affects editorial decisions on a daily basis. B, kind of break down the financials. I think that, the fact that CNN made $1 billion in profit in 2020 says something. That's profit. That's after costs. That's not revenue. They made $1 billion in profit. Fox made, I think, more than $2 billion in profit the year of the pandemic. And it affects everyone across the spectrum. MSNBC and Fox News might look different, but they're functioning the same, and they have the same motivation. At this point, Fox News, some of their on-air personalities have been pushing ideas that are anti-science, are not based on science, and are wrong, or might be pushing ideas, about elections. They're doing it not because that's what they believe themselves, because Fox News has a vaccine mandate themselves. They believe in the science, and so enough to the point where they made all of their employees get the vaccine. But on air, it's a different story. There needs to be a public awareness campaign helping people understand how it works, but also coming at it from a nonpartisan perspective, because it really does affect everyone. It might look differently on the different networks, but the underlying motivations are the same, and it affects the accuracy of what you're getting on air. And so that's part of it. But I also think that, okay, so I don't like cable news. I understand it's bad. I understand it's not really good quality. Then what? Where else do I get my news and information? Most people don't have time to scour through all the different news stories every day, whether it's print or, I prefer to read and listen to my news, but that does take more time. It's easier. And most people, we know, prefer to watch the news. It's where most people, even online or even on their handheld devices. Who is generating that content? For the most part, it's going to be coming from cable news. I mean, there are other sources that have bubbled up, but for the most part, that material is coming from cable. There needs to be some other 24-hour news source that is TV or video that is trustworthy. It's worth spending time looking. What else could we be doing to generate content that is interesting? I mean, it doesn't have to be boring. In public broadcasting, PBS, there's really only 1 hour a day. That's the news hour. It's quality, but it's only 1 hour a day. It can't compete against the 24-hour news cycle on cable. But I also feel like you can be generating content that is much more diverse, reflects different communities across the nation, and that's urban and rural. I think there's just a better way to go about providing the news, telling the news, in a much more diverse way and interesting. It wouldn't take very much creativity to come up with a better source than what we have now.
First of all, I really commend you so much for embarking on this adventure to really broadcast the ways that the media industry is essentially feeding itself. It's really something that I hope lawmakers and policymakers and voters and whoever is involved in the political process can really understand more about why this industry acts the way it does. So I just want to acknowledge really the importance of your mission. The second thing is a question about just civility more broadly, which is, out of all this, what do you think every single person in this world can do to broaden the arena of civility without or with very minimal influences of ratings, of bonuses, and the other things that cannot and should not conflate with the sustainability of our political environment?
I would say, first of all, don't watch cable. Don't reward them for the work that they're doing. Try to turn that off. If you can, find a few sources. I know time is limited, but find a few sources that you feel are reliable and are trying to be honest with you. Again, I feel like NPR is a good source for that. They're not perfect, and no newsroom is perfect, and that's the nature of the news. You're writing the first draft. They do get things wrong. We all have our own biases. You have to have that realization that no source is going to be perfect. But I can tell you, in public broadcasting, they're trying to do their best. They're working in earnest to try to generate news around the clock that you can use and is reliable and is an honest portrayal of the world that we live in. The other thing about social media is we're all kind of in our own bubbles now. And I think I would encourage people to try to get out of that as much as possible. Don't spend so much time on Facebook, because I see Facebook does it to me. It's like what shows up in my feed are people and stories that probably think like me. And I don't unfriend people who I disagree with on purpose, because I don't want to, make that bubble even bigger or worse. But that sometimes that just means getting out, get off your device, go to an event, what might be small community events going on. And I've done that myself. And I come back and I'm like, I would not have had that conversation if I hadn't gone to that event. I didn't really want to go. It was, I didn't really expect much from it. But I saw people I was forced to interact with and be civil with. Otherwise, I might have a certain grudge against a certain person, so I might not interact with them. But when you see them in person, you kind of have to be nice. And you can't just people are not as likely to be jerks in real life as they are online. And so I would say as much person to person in real life interaction, I would encourage that as much as possible.
Very well said. Yes, get out of the house, or find some kind of activity where you can interact with someone. And otherwise, I'm just tired of this. Have you've probably seen a lot of the slow news day, or one of those moments when you've seen a series of stories. And I'm just like, I feel like nothing's really happening, but you're just kind of, this news network is telling me the effect of stuffed animals on people's well-being in supermarkets or something. I'm just making something up, but you just see that and I'm like, I think people should get out more, Yeah.
And, the story about the stuffed animals in supermarkets, they think that will appeal to a certain demographic. And so that's why they will do it, instead of talking about how difficult it is for, whether it's immigrants or police officers. They just don't, those stories are out there and we could tap into them, but they feel like they don't want to get in the weeds on this stuff. They feel like the audience doesn't have the attention span for it. And I think that they do. I think humans are naturally curious. And as long as they're learning something new, they're going to continue to listen or to watch, because that it's in our DNA to if that's something I don't know, I feel like I need to know it for survival,
Right.
or you will continue to watch or listen.
Yeah, stuffed animals in supermarkets, not so much for me. Unless it's like the giant teddy bear in Costco, which I can't find anymore, but I need to get one of those, because you never know. I mean, it's
these days it would be nice to cuddle up with a big stuffed animal. That's for sure.
That's right. So Ariana, before we wrap up our program today, as you might know, and as many in the audience know, this show is a lot based on Washington's farewell address, really some of the values that kind of come out of that speech that he delivered in 1796. So out of the 6 pillars that I've outlined, which patriotism, faith, national unity, education, fiscal responsibility, civility, out of those six, what is one or more of these pillars that you think really stand out in terms of the conversation we had today, and really just the issues and platform that you have nowadays?
Well, I would definitely have to say education and civility. The more you know, the more you want to know. Ignorance is you don't know what you don't know. So the more you learn, the better we all are. I believe in that from just a humanist perspective, but also thinking in terms of the strength of the country, our standing in the world. We need people to be better educated. And sometimes I feel like I should probably spend more time on education than journalism, because some people say cable news looks the way it does because that's what the audience wants, because they aren't as educated as they should be or could be, pandering to the lowest common denominator and trying to get the biggest audience that way. I mean, that's a very complicated subject, but I do think that having more critical thinking in our schools would probably be a good thing for everyone. And obviously learn more about how government works, what doesn't work. Are we really being represented? Lawrence Lessig wrote a great book a few years ago called They Don't Represent Us. And he's quantified to a full extent how our governments work from the federal level on down and what we could be doing differently. I don't know what the right answers are on that front, but the more you engage on that, I think the better off everyone will be.
Absolutely. Well, Ariana, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your story. And I just want to reiterate once again, I know that after you left MSNBC, you're off to new ventures and all that, but I really think you share a very important message for people of all walks of life, because at some point, right, everyone encounters cable news or social media, or picks up a newspaper. I still get paper versions of the Wall Street Journal, so maybe I'm a little old school in that sense, but the way we consume information is in many ways perhaps more important than just the information that we get, because when we look at the system and how things are repeatedly created, that's when we can maybe find more solutions and be able to stop some of this systemic polarization and this division that we don't frankly need and we don't really want inherently for the most part. What are some ways that people can learn more about what you're doing and what you're up to? I'll obviously link those in the show notes below, but if you just give a quick summary, that'd be great. I'll leave that down in the show notes for the audience.
Sure, thanks. We'll be making an announcement soon about a new organization. So I will certainly make it there and on my personal website. And so my Twitter handle is Ariana Pekary. My website is arianapekary.net. And I am, writing periodic columns for Columbia Journalism Review. So you can find my work there. I think those are the main places.
Great. I will link those down. Again, Aria, thank you so much for coming on to Friends and Fellow Citizens. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. And thanks for taking up this topic.
All right, everyone, that'll wrap up our episode for today. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Ariana Pekary. This critical topic about the media, about polarization. I hope we'll continue this conversation on Friends and Fellow Citizens. Make sure, once again, to subscribe. Check out the links down in the show notes below. Have a great rest of your day and rest of your week. And remember, a day in America always gets better when we are with our friends and fellow citizens.